The Seahawks match up against Bill Belichick and the Patriots in Week 2. Australian left back Brad Smith returns to the Sounders, and we answer questions from you guys in the first ever Around the Sound Q&A. Let's take it around the sound. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Around the Sound. We're on episode 3 already, chugging along with this thing. Whether you're listening or you're watching the video, audio version of this podcast is available wherever you get your podcast, and the video version of this podcast is available on YouTube. Every episode uploaded to YouTube the same time as it's uploaded everywhere else in video format. Just go to YouTube and search up PTHOM space media. That's PTOM Media. Follow me on Twitter. Keep up with everything that is going on in my life at the Peyton Thomas, and follow the Instagram for the podcast and get updated every time there's a new episode of Around the Sound on Instagram. That handle is at Around the Sound Seattle, all one word. Like I said in the intro, in the opening, we're going to have a Q&A later in the episode, so thank you to you guys that submitted questions for this one. We'll probably be able to get to at least a few of them. We'll have to see how much time is left. But I want to jump right in and talk about the Seahawks and the Patriots. I said in the last episode, episode 2, that the game was in Foxborough. My bad on that one. I wasn't really paying attention to the schedule and to the previews. And no, the game is in Seattle. And I'm assuming that the smoke will clear out at least enough for the air quality to be good enough to play on Sunday. So I'm assuming that the game will be played in Seattle unless the NFL decides to do something crazy like the MLB did and switch up where the home team and the away teams play, but we'll get to that later in the episode. So Brian Schottenheimer, the offensive coordinator for the Seahawks, said quite a few things to the media this week after I recorded episode 2, and I wanted to get to a lot of the stuff he said and kind of break it down. The first thing he was asked about was how the offensive line performed. I know I criticized the offensive line in episode 2 a little bit. They did give up 3 sacks on the record, but the main point that Schottenheimer wanted us to take out of this Week 1 game is that the O-line was a lot better. They played a lot better than the stats really said that they did. He had mentioned that one of the sacks in the first half was on him, and the play calling apparently wasn't what it really should have been. One of the other ones was on decision-making from Russ. He said in reality, the offensive line really only gave up 1 bad sack. Posick looked great that game. The more clips that I see, I'm really impressed with how consistent he is and comfortable he is at center. He's a guy that is a massive presence on that line. It's just a lot of times the technique where he's supposed to be has kind of struggled for him in his career. But everything that we've heard from Pete Carroll and coaches and the offensive line guys is that Posick has really made strides, especially this last offseason and over the course of last year, filling into that center spot. I think that's a reason that the Seahawks were so willing to let Justin Britt walk. Obviously, Justin Britt did have one of the biggest contracts on the offensive line other than Dwayne Brown, but they did realize that Ethan Posick could be that guy at center this year. They also picked up B.J. Finney in the offseason from the Steelers. Steelers put him on a tender, and the Seahawks were able to pick him up. I think a lot of people expected Posick to start at center and eventually for B.J. Finney to take over. I think that was the long-term view of the Seahawks for B.J. Finney to eventually take that position. But with performances like this, I'm not really sure if Russell would be okay with switching up the line like that. As long as Posick stays healthy and he keeps playing like this, I thought he had a very good and consistent game. Damian Lewis, the rookie that we took out of LSU in the 3rd round, I thought he had a great game. I saw on Twitter Ben Fennell tweeted highlights from that game from Damian Lewis, and the short highlight reel included 2 great pancakes. Now, the Falcons don't have the biggest defensive line, but I thought that those 2 pancakes were really, really impressive, especially in your first NFL game. Offensive line is a position that it's really difficult to hop right in as a rookie and really contribute to your team effectively. A lot of times NFL linemen are quite a bit bigger than the average college lineman, and the defensive linemen that you're facing on the other side are a completely different breed to the ones that even you see in places like the SEC or the Big Ten. In Damian Lewis's case, it was the SEC. Last year in college football, Damian Lewis was a part of that extremely, extremely good LSU offensive line. Joe Burrow, it seemed like he dropped back and had an absolute eternity back there, and that's one of the reasons I actually expected Joe Burrow to struggle coming into the NFL was the Bengals do not really have a complete offensive line right now, and LSU, I thought that he had the best offensive line in the country, and it really carried him to that national championship. But on a tangent here, I will give Joe Burrow credit. We saw in the Thursday night game, I thought he played pretty well, even though they did lose to the Browns and started 0-2. The Bengals really could have won that first game if Randy Bullock could have hit that field goal to tie it up late. It was a chip shot, so they should have been in that game in week 1. Well, they were in it. They should have had a chance to win it in overtime, but 0-2 start for the Bengals. But if you're a Joe Burrow fan, I think that you're very optimistic about how he's started to perform for the Bengals. I think he's been really, really good. A lot of people expected him to jump right in. I said, as kind of a counterpoint, that coming from LSU, where you had such a great team around you compared to all the defenses you were playing, I thought it might be tough for him to go into a Cincinnati offense that really only has Joe Mixon and A.J. Green. Tyler Boyd's not bad, but I think that he certainly has a lot less playmaking options or dominators up front like Damian Lewis was in college football. So I thought that he might struggle a little bit, have a lot less time in the pocket, but I thought he's adapted pretty well so far. Back to Damian Lewis, though, it's a really encouraging sight to see a rookie jump right into this game and hold his own. I thought that he played really well. He was consistent. You see a lot of times the technique is off and holding penalties occur a lot for rookies. I don't believe that Damian Lewis picked up a holding penalty in this game, and he wasn't really close to. I don't think there was too much hands to the face moments or anything like that really hindered his game, and I thought he played really well. He was a great pulling guard at LSU. Clyde Edwards-Helaire, the new playmaker over in Kansas City, as if they needed another one, he was kind of the pulling guard. LSU, when they'd send Clyde Edwards-Helaire out wide on a pitch or on an outside handoff, they would usually send the right guard to the left guard pulling. Damian Lewis, being that right guard at LSU, was usually the guy that was pulling outside of the tackle. When we talk about guards pulling, you think about a 5-man offensive line in a standard formation. The running back runs to the right. Let's say that the quarterback, Joe Burrow, takes the snap, pitches it out to Clyde Edwards-Helaire. That guard on the right side will pull off of the offensive line right after the snap and go outside of the tackle and sort of be the lead blocker for that running back in the backfield. The running back, the ultimate goal is to get to the corner and pick up some yards. And so Damian Lewis was a great pulling guard and a great guard in the run block. I think the biggest question mark about his play is how is he going to really do in the passing game, especially in the NFL. I thought the Falcons, their defensive line is a little bit smaller than others, but it's certainly not a bad defensive line. They certainly pressured Russ several times, but I felt like he really held his own and had a pretty solid game up there. Next up, Shoddy was asked about all of the passing offense. I think the Seahawks started out with 7 passes in their first 11 plays, which is something that we haven't seen in a very, very long time from the Seahawks. And 11 out of the 15 plays in the first quarter, 11 out of the 15 snaps were also passes. So he was asked, is this going to be the new Seahawks offense going forward? Are they going to go out and this spread style kind of offense, put people all over the field, rotate personnel all the time, and Russell Wilson's going to be the guy that's getting the ball everywhere in the passing game? And he kind of backed up on that one. He said, look, we're looking for matchups, and going into this week 1 performance against the Falcons, we really thought that the weak point of this team was the secondary. And to a point, he's absolutely correct. This Falcons secondary is not what it was on that Super Bowl team. They had guys like Robert Alford and Desmond Trufant that dominated guys at the cornerback position. Neither of those guys are still in Atlanta anymore. And I think that Brian Schottenheimer and Pete Carroll did a really great job of highlighting the weak points in the Falcons secondary, watching what coverages they were used to running when they went 6-2 in their last 8 games of the 2019 season. And they really found success, not just on those opening drives, but throughout the game, scoring over 40 points. You clearly did something right on offense, assuming most of those touchdowns are offensive touchdowns. Going into this game, I think a lot of people expect the Seahawks to start running the ball more. And I think one of the reasons Schottenheimer said that in the press conference is the Seahawks' main game plan going into this Patriots game is to establish the run and is to lean on those running backs. If you have Chris Carson or Carlos Hyde in fantasy, I would start either of them because I think these guys are going to be the workhorses this game. They're going to get plenty of carries. And the reason for that is the weak part of this Patriots defense is not the secondary. It's in the front 7. This Patriots secondary is still very, very good. They've got Stephon Gilmore, who right now, I don't know if there's another corner that is better than Stephon Gilmore, worth his salt. And then they still have the McCourty twins back there that are getting older but are still very, very productive in the secondary, ball hawks. The front 7's a little bit weak. Patriots had 7 players opt out due to COVID-19, more than any other team in the league, and 2 of those players are probably the two biggest run-stopping pieces. The biggest, none bigger than Donta Hightower. He's done it for the Patriots. He fits perfectly into Bill Belichick's system. He kind of plays an underneath Mike linebacker. So he plays on the inside. He sometimes plays on the outside, but he's always near the line of scrimmage. He can drop back into coverage, but his main purpose is to plug those gaps defensively and keep the running back from gaining significant yardage. He's a run stopper through and through. They're missing him. He opted out. They're also missing Patrick Chung, who is a safety by trade, but in reality, he plays a little bit similar to Jamal Adams, a prototype strong safety that's going to push up against the line. They're going to send him on different blitzes, and he's also going to try to get to the running back. Without those two guys, the Patriots front seven is really missing a massive part of their scheme and the way that they try to stop the run. So I think the Seahawks are going to look to exploit them on inside runs, outside runs, and I would expect to still see the screen pass game play a factor. We saw that against the Falcons as the Seahawks did run several screen passes throughout the game. Chris Carson scored on one in the first half. I would expect to see that again. You want to get those running backs into space. You want to get Chris Carson, Carlos Hyde outside and in front of the first tier of defense, which is that defensive line. You get those guys out in space, run past the defensive line. If you get those blockers out there, that's another thing I thought the offense did really well is in week one is on those screen passes. We normally had 2 or 3 blockers out there every time protecting the running back and putting blocks on. And when you can do that, screen passes can be very, very deadly. And we saw that. Chris Carson getting the touchdown. So I would expect the Seahawks to be back to establishing the run. We're going to see a similar game plan to, starting out, we're going to see a similar game plan to what the Seahawks have been offensively in the last 5 years. But I think the big difference right now between the Seattle trying to establish the run game and between Seattle the last 5 years trying to establish the run game is in that week one performance, Brian Schottenheimer, Russell Wilson, and Pete Carroll have basically told the NFL that if the run doesn't work, we are very capable of putting the ball in Russell Wilson's hands and letting Russ cook, and we're very willing to do that if things go awry. So Hawks are going to start with the run. The Seahawks are going to come out. They're going to run the ball to on the first drive, probably 70 or 80% of snaps. They're going to see what kind of success they can get. But let's say that they try to do that for the first 3 drives. They get stopped on all 3, have to punt. Let's say the Patriots get up 13-14 nothing. I think the Seahawks are going to be willing to completely shift their game plan and take a risk and start going after the Patriots defense in a different way and shifting to maybe a more pass-heavy attack. Maybe try doing play-action passes to the tight ends so you can still avoid that secondary, but you can get playmakers like Will Dissly or like Greg Olsen out into space. That's the big difference is back before, I think that even if the run wasn't working, Seahawks were trying to stick with it. They're trying to stick with it deep into the third quarter until they were down a significant margin. Then they were putting the ball in Russ's hands. I think that if the run starts to go awry in the first or at the beginning of the second quarter, I think there's going to be absolutely no hesitation between Schottenheimer or Carroll to start putting the ball in Russ's hands and trying to see what kind of magic he can produce. Injury, we had a little bit of injury news this week. Left tackle Dwayne Brown had a full practice to end the week, but he was limited, I think Wednesday, to he had some injury struggles last week, but he's back to a normal workload now, so I would expect him to take a healthy amount of snaps on Sunday. They had talked a little bit about resting him more days. He's getting up there. I think Dwayne Brown's 34, 35 now, so he had been limited in practice a few days before the week 1 game. I think he did have a lingering injury or two, but the Seahawks have stayed a little bit private on that matter, not telling anybody exactly what's going on with Dwayne Brown, but I would be surprised to see him take anything but a normal workload on Sunday. Philip Dorsett, he missed the game against the Falcons. He was still limited in practice, but he is slated to be at least probable for this game, so I would expect that he gets at least a few snaps against his former team. It would be cool to see Philip Dorsett catch a few big plays in this game if he's healthy enough to do so, or a touchdown against Bill Belichick and his former team. Philip Dorsett, a Super Bowl champion with the Patriots. Bill Belichick also talked to the media this week. He had a few things to say about Russell. Russell also talked to the media this week on a similar tone, and it's the thing that nobody around the NFL, nobody in the national media seems to want to talk about when it comes to Russell. It's such a terrible thing to say. Everybody gasps when you say it, that Russell Wilson is a more complete quarterback in the NFL than anyone else that plays the game. And Bill Belichick, the quote was, honestly, I think he's in a way underrated by the media or the fans. I don't know, but I just don't really see anybody better than this player. Colin Cowherd made a great argument for Russell Wilson. He seems to make a great argument for Russell Wilson every other week. Danny and Gallant over at 710 ESPN made a great argument for Russell Wilson over guys like Patrick Mahomes or Deshaun Watson or Lamar Jackson. And they're absolutely right. There's no player in the NFL that's a more complete quarterback. But if you give me a football team and you say, pick any quarterback that you want to build this franchise around, right now I think almost everybody's going to take Patrick Mahomes, including myself. Patrick Mahomes is a lot younger. You're going to have him for a lot longer period of time. Russell Wilson is now getting older, which seems crazy to me because it seems like he was just drafted into the league back in 2012. But he's getting older compared to a lot of the quarterbacks in the league. He's starting to be one of the old guys out there. Patrick Mahomes is one of the new stars in the NFL. He's the face of the NFL right now. So most people are going to pick him as far as building a franchise around. But if you talk about skill, just raw talent, the most complete quarterback in the NFL, I believe, is Russell Wilson. And I think that if Russell Wilson was placed into the Kansas City offense, I think they have a better offensive line over there. If he had weapons like Edwards-Helaire, Hill, Sammy Watkins, Travis Kelce, the Chiefs are just stacked. I think that would be an absolute explosion to football. If Russell Wilson was somehow moved to the Chiefs, like just for a season, just to see what would happen to the stats, that would absolutely break football. It would be crazy to see. Russell Wilson, like I said, also had something to say about it. He went about it in a little more humble fashion, a little more Russ-like fashion, something that you would expect. But he basically said what it boils down to is he wants to be the best to ever do this and remembered as one of the best to ever do this. I think Russell Wilson is already probably a future Hall of Famer. I think most people would put him in that category, and I'd be very surprised at the end of his career if we're looking back and not regarding him as a first ballot Hall of Famer. But he's got a lot of work to do if he wants to be in that conversation. I mean, you have people like Tom Brady that have several rings, and Russell Wilson right now, for all of the work that he's done since he's entered the league, he's only had one. And part of that, you want to put the blame on Pete Carroll a little bit. Pete Carroll's done plenty. You want to put the blame on Darrell Bevell, the offensive coordinator for the Seahawks for a long time, the one who called that pass play on the 1 yard line in 2014 against the Patriots. Speaking of which, on that play, the Malcolm Butler interception in the 2014 Super Bowl, a lot of people were talking about that play this week. This is only the second matchup between the Seahawks and the Patriots since that play happened, which 6 years, it seems crazy, but I guess teams in the NFC and AFC, you only play 4 years in a regular schedule outside of the Super Bowl, so makes sense. The first meeting after that interception was the 2016 meeting up in Foxborough. Bill Belichick also said this week to the media that that was one of the most competitive games he'd ever played. Seahawks ended up winning that game by a touchdown. That was back in 2016. Rosters on both teams have almost completely turned over except for Russell Wilson and Bobby Wagner for the Seahawks. Now in 2020 in Seattle, we're going to have a completely different matchup. Going into this game on Sunday, I think the biggest question for the Seahawks defensively is what version of Cam Newton are we really going to see? Because I think this is a Cam Newton that's older. He's not the same player that we saw in Carolina. This isn't 2015 Cam Newton that's able to dictate and dominate like that 15-1 Carolina Panthers team that came oh so close to winning Super Bowl 50. And last week, we saw Cam Newton take 15 carries for 75 yards and 2 touchdowns. That's quite a hefty workload in the running game for a quarterback that's getting up there. Cam Newton's 31 now, so I think he's a little more prone to injury now that he's getting older. He might not be quite as fast, although he looked like he still had some speed against the Dolphins. But I think part of the reason that he carried the ball so many times is looking back on the highlights from that game, it looked like the Dolphins defense was just giving up the quarterback run every time. They shifted all their focus to not letting those running backs get out wide or not letting the bubble screens happen. So a lot of times on those run pass options that the Patriots like to run, Cam Newton just saw the best option every time was for him to turn around and take off. And ultimately the Patriots were able to win the game and Cam was able to protect himself. But if you come up against a defense that's more disciplined than the Dolphins defense, which I think the Seahawks defense is absolutely more disciplined than the Dolphins defense, they're going to keep more of an eye on the quarterback. You have scary guys on the other side of the line like Bobby Wagner or KJ Wright or Jamal Adams that are very capable of watching the quarterback and watching those keepers and keeping Cam behind the line of scrimmage. So I think that if Cam wants to run for 15 carries in this game this Sunday, I think it's going to be very dangerous, and I think Josh McDaniel, the offensive coordinator for the Patriots, is going to keep him from doing so. Because if you're a quarterback and you're carrying the ball 15 times a game, even if you're Superman, even if you're 2015 Cam Newton, it's a very, very dangerous game to play if you're the franchise quarterback, because you see quarterback injuries all the time on those runs. Remember the Jimmy Garoppolo, we'll talk about the rest of the NFC West in that game, the Arizona Cardinals and San Francisco 49ers last week. Arizona Cardinals taking care of the San Francisco 49ers, but we saw Jimmy Garoppolo in 2018 try to stretch out a run for a few more yards against the Vikings and ended up getting injured. So you got to be careful as a quarterback. as an offensive coordinator, you have to put your quarterback in less of those scenarios where he's going to be prone to taking the big hit. And I think that is one thing that Russell Wilson and Pete Carroll, I feel like, have done a great job of ever since Russell has been in the league. Russell himself, in his playmaking ability when he's improvising plays, is very, very good about avoiding those big hits. But Pete Carroll rarely puts him play calling wise, or whoever the offensive coordinator was, whether it's Bevel or whether it's Schottenheimer now. I think the offensive coordinator, Pete Carroll, as far as play calling goes, rarely put Russ in a scenario where he's probably going to take a big hit, or there's a likely probability that he's going to take a big hit. Like I mentioned a minute ago, I wanted to talk about what else happened around the NFC West. And what I gathered from last week's games, we saw the Rams take care and get a W against the Cowboys, is the NFC West is going to be a dogfight this year. I don't really think there's too weak of a team in the NFC West. I would pick the Rams to finish last in the division this year, but I think outside of the stacked NFC South, where the worst team in the NFC South has Teddy Bridgewater, who's an underrated quarterback, and Christian McCaffrey on it, that's the worst team in the NFC South. I think outside of that division, the NFC West is probably the strongest division in football right now. But the 49ers also have some significant problems. I think they were the favorites. Last year, they won the division and made it to the Super Bowl. But I wonder if they have a little bit of that post-Super Bowl loss hangover going on. We've seen a phenomenon in the NFL the last 10 or 15 years of Super Bowl losers really struggling the next year to get back to the playoffs. We've seen this from plenty of teams, and I wonder if we're going to see this again for the 49ers. They're having significant injury troubles. Kittle got injured this week, and what I wanted to talk about with Jimmy Garoppolo is it was almost Jimmy Garoppolo who caused it. If you go back and look at the play where Kittle was hit and took that blow to his knee, it was actually a poor throw from Jimmy Garoppolo to the outside. Kittle had to sort of extend for the catch and sort of exposed himself to taking that big hit to the knee. Kittle's ruled out for week 2 against the Jets, but I still think San Francisco will be able to take care of one of the bottom feeders in the NFL. But San Francisco also has some pretty significant long-term injury problems in the wide receiver position. They went out and picked up Mohamed Sanu. This week, Mohamed Sanu was dropped by the Patriots. He's not really what he was a few years ago over at the Falcons. He was pretty okay at the Patriots, but for Bill Belichick to drop him, I think it's a little bit telling about where Mohamed Sanu's at right now. So it seems like a bit of a desperate move from the 49ers to pick him up, try to get any other playmaker on that offense for Jimmy Garoppolo, because until Kittle comes back, he doesn't really have any other significant options in the passing game. 49ers still have a pretty decent run game, but we'll have to see how this develops, because we saw them beat by a pretty good Cardinals team in week 1. Isaiah Simmons did give up a touchdown. I would expect him to be better over the course of this year for the Arizona Cardinals. But the Arizona Cardinals, Kyler Murray, DeAndre Hopkins, his first game in a Cardinals jersey, I thought those guys looked pretty good. The offensive line for Arizona is still a mess, so Kyler Murray is going to have to run for his life, similar to what Russell Wilson had to do early in his career. But Kyler and the Arizona offense looks willing to throw the ball 60 times a game, and they look very capable of throwing the ball 60 times a game, especially when you have players like Larry Fitzgerald, who catches everything, and one of the best receivers, if not the best receiver, probably the second best receiver to Michael Thomas, but the second best receiver in the NFL, DeAndre Hopkins. He looked great on Sunday, and I think you can expect those consistent performances from DeAndre Hopkins week in, week out. I think the Cardinals are still a year or two away from really competing, but that result was really optimistic, or really, I think you have to have an optimistic frame of mind if you're a Cardinals fan after that result. This defense is younger. They're still flushing out some of the older guys off that defense, but Arizona is going to be a team to watch, especially if Kyler Murray's able to continue developing. He looks like a little bit of a mini Russell Wilson out there. He doesn't quite have the deep ball developed that Russell Wilson does, but he certainly has the arm strength and the baseball IQ to slide, unlike some quarterbacks like Joe Flacco, who were completely unable to slide throughout their whole careers. So we'll have to keep an eye on Arizona. Like I said, the Rams picked up a win against Dallas on Sunday Night Football. But I don't think either of these teams are particularly good. I think the NFC East across the board is really bad, and I think Dallas is not even the best team in a bad division. I think Dak Prescott is not that great of a quarterback, and I think they're going to struggle this year. The Dallas offensive line, which was once the Dallas offensive line, which once made DeMarco Murray look like the best running back in the league, has started to struggle again. They've started to lose pieces off of that offensive line, and although they definitely could have won this game against the Rams, Jalen Ramsey sold a PI call at the end that essentially iced the game for the Rams. But the Cowboys, had that PI call gone the other way, had there been a better call by the refs there, I think that Dallas had a good chance to win this game. I think both of these teams are overrated, though. I still think the Rams have some significant issues. They paid everybody. They lost some of those playmakers like Todd Gurley, who they expected to be around a little bit longer. The Rams still have some great pieces like Jalen Ramsey, like Aaron Donald, but I don't think Jared Goff. I think people have started to figure out Jared Goff, and more importantly, I think people started to figure out Sean McVay's scheme. McVay looked like he was ready to take over the NFL about 2 or 3 years ago. Patriots shut him down in the Super Bowl, and ever since then, they haven't really looked like the same team. So after week 1, I don't think my predictions for the NFC West have really changed all that much. I still think Seattle's probably the best team in the division. Arizona's not too far behind. San Francisco definitely has some significant problems they're going to work on. We'll have to see how they perform the rest of the season, but I still think the Rams are probably the worst team in the division. I want to give an honorary mention to the Sounders this episode. Not too much going on in that department, but they did get back Brad Smith. Brad Smith was a huge part of that 2019 MLS Cup winning squad. He was great on that left wing. He plays a wingback type of style, something that you don't see all that much of in the MLS. You see it a lot in Europe, of guys who are very capable of working all the way forward on the pitch and crossing balls in from the left or right side, but also being able to get back and take care of their defensive duties. Brad Smith was the master of that. He racked up 7 assists in 2019 and had a huge few playoff performances in the game against LAFC and the MLS Cup against Toronto. It was a little bit of an expensive addition. He was slated to be like a $2 million transfer when we let him go in 2019. We did get him on a free transfer. Due to COVID-19, he was left out of the Cardiff squad, left out of the Bournemouth squad, both teams in England that he was once contracted to, and he was kind of left in limbo because of coronavirus. He wasn't signed to a team, and really this was a opportunistic pickup from the Sounders. I don't think they, as much as they wanted to bring him back before COVID, I don't think it was really in the cards because Brad Smith's value was going to continue to go up. He had showed strides. He showed that he was reaching part of his potential here at Seattle, and I think bringing him back was a really opportunistic pickup from the Sounders. We had him on loan the first time in 2019. Now he's signed to a permanent deal, so definitely expect for him to stick around for at least a year or two. I wouldn't be surprised, however, if he continues on the form that he had in 2019. If he builds on that and plays even better, I wouldn't be surprised if he starts to be poached by a mid to lower level Premier League team and goes back to England. We got plenty of depth now on that left side, the Sounders do. They have Jovan Jones, they have Nuhu, they have Brad Smith, all capable of playing left back. They play Jovan Jones a little bit higher up the pitch sometimes, playing at that left mid, left winger position. They also can shift him to the right side if you need, but there's plenty of depth on that Sounders roster. More players. There's also been rumors that DeAndre Yedlin could return to the MLS. That would be another expensive pickup for the Sounders. He was on that 2014 U.S. Open Cup and Supporters Shield winning squad. That would be an expensive pickup, but man, if they're, regardless of whether they are able to pick up DeAndre Yedlin or not, this is a really, really deep squad. And there's going to be struggles to get everybody in this squad minutes. And we're going to have to see some massive squad rotation. The Sounders have 3 good left backs now, like I mentioned, between Jovan, Nuhu. Nuhu's made strides since Brad Smith was able to leave. He's gotten more minutes. So we'll have to see how those guys rotate. I would assume we see Jovan Jones very rarely back at the left back position with both Brad Smith and Nuhu. We'll have to see how much playing time Nuhu gets now that Brad Smith's back. He was a guy that was a younger guy, didn't quite have the experience that Brad Smith had when Brad Smith came to this team in 2019. Nuhu's really showed strides since Brad Smith left. He's been able to play consistently at that left back position. Now that Brad Smith's back, I would expect that they're going to be back to splitting playing time. I don't know if we'll ever be able to put all 3 of those guys on the pitch at the same time, but I would expect at least a decent reduction in minutes for Nuhu or Jovan Jones. We'll have to see what happens. The Mariners were forced to relocate for a crucial part of their season due to the smoke. I wasn't sure on Wednesday's episode exactly how the MLB was going to handle the smoke situation in Seattle. They had postponed Tuesday's game at the time I was recording Wednesday's episode. We weren't sure about Wednesday's game. What the MLB decided to do was move Wednesday's game and the makeup on Thursday. That game that was supposed to be on Tuesday was moved to Thursday. Both of those 2 games were moved down to San Francisco, but the Mariners were still set to play as the home team. So it's very, very weird watching a Mariners broadcast where they were the home team but playing in San Francisco. Then they're set to start a series against the Padres on Friday night, which runs through Sunday, a 3-game series against the Padres in San Diego, but still as the home team. Those 2 series were supposed to be played in Seattle. Due to the smoke mix-up, we're going to have them down in San Francisco and in San Diego. They lost their last 3 games, one of those against the A's, and then swept in the 2-game series against the Giants. Mariners go into this Padres series down 3 games behind the Astros now. Astros were able to stretch that advantage back out to 3 games, so we're getting to crunch time in the MLB now. If the Mariners really want to make a playoff push at this thing, I think they're going to have to take 2 or 3 from the Padres, and especially 2 or 3 from the Astros. That'll be the big teller. All right, looks like we got a little bit of time to do this Q&A. We'll get to probably 2 or 3 questions, but I wanted to highlight at least a few of you guys who submitted questions. Thank you for submitting questions. We'll have more Q&A opportunities if I don't get to your question. So if I don't get to it, look out for the next one and ask it again. We'll see if it comes up. Who is going to win the MLS this year, and who's going to be the favorite going into the playoffs? It's a good question. I think Seattle's certainly in that conversation. I don't know if that's the answer that they wanted me to elicit, but Seattle's certainly in that conversation. They always get hot at the end of the year, the slow start narrative, but then by the time August, September, October rolls around, it seems like the Sounders are always the hottest team in the league. It's a stacked Western Conference, though. LA Galaxy's been playing pretty well recently. LAFC is always a danger to turn it on and make a run in the playoffs. I really think that the 2 biggest threats right now are probably Columbus or Minnesota. I think Columbus is looking very good. They're on top of the East, and they have the most points in the MLS right now. They are favorites to win the Supporters' Shield as we kind of wind down the MLS season. We're in the second half of the shortened, modified season now. And Minnesota also look like a very, very good team. They're one of the strongest defensive teams in the league. They have Ozzie Alonso. They have Defender of the Year Ike Opara. They have Romain Mentoner at right back, who's a very, very solid right back. They also picked up Kai Kamara, who is an experienced MLS striker. They just picked him up, I believe, this morning as I'm recording this. But they picked up Kai Kamara, so they're going to have some more firepower going forward. Minnesota could be a very, very dangerous team come playoff time. So I would say one of those guys. Who are my favorite Seattle athletes of all time and why? All time. I'm going to have to go with 2 guys. I would say Cam Chancellor first for the way he played and how he glued together that Legion of Boom, because the highlight plays that Cam Chancellor was able to create, I love a strong safety who can hit, who can disrupt plays in the run game, but also make plays in the secondary, make big interceptions. So probably Cam Chancellor, but my second player would probably be Jordan Morris. I love Jordan Morris playing for the Sounders. He was a local kid, grew up on Mercer Island. He had the opportunity to get a big contract and potentially go to England or Germany to play soccer overseas in one of those big 5 leagues over in Europe. He decided that he was not going to do that. He was going to stay home at his boyhood club at the Sounders, take a slight pay cut, but he's still getting paid plenty of money here in Seattle. So Jordan Morris also does a ton of great stuff in the community. He has his foundation and always meets up with kids before each home game, I think it's before any game. So probably one of those 2 guys. Who will be a bigger rival for the Kraken, the Sharks or the Canucks? Seattle Kraken, I haven't really mentioned them since the trailer, but I'm really, really excited to have an NHL team in Seattle now. The Sharks or the Canucks? That's a good question. I think we'll have a rivalry against both of them, and I think that it'll be a pretty good rivalry between the Kraken and the Sharks and the Kraken and the Nucks. The Canucks look like the most logical choice due to simply proximity, but I think I'll make both cases here. The Canucks have really been waiting for a close rival for a long time. Both the Flames and the Oilers are probably the closest ones, but over in Alberta, that's pretty hefty drive for a lot of Vancouver fans. You can't really do a day trip to either of those places, as if you were a Vancouver fan doing a day trip to Seattle, which is 2.25 or something like that. Not a bad day trip at all. You can make it down there and back. So the Canucks have been waiting for a local rival for a really long time. So I think there's a natural rivalry that's going to develop. But I think the case against the Canucks is a lot of Seattle Kraken fans that are going to move over. I think they were Vancouver Canucks fans. I think a lot of people in the Seattle market that are big hockey fans before the Kraken were announced were Canucks fans. And I know a lot of that market will shift over to the Kraken once the Kraken begin to play games. But I do think that there's going to be some love with those people that switch over to the Kraken. There's going to be a little bit place in their hearts for the Canucks that have given them hockey for the last few decades when Seattle hasn't had an NHL team. So I think there's something to that. The rivalry with the Sharks, I think it all comes down to whether the Kraken choose to go after Brent Burns in the expansion draft. Brent Burns, he's getting up there in age. He's probably mid-30s now, defenseman for the San Jose Sharks. The Kraken mentioned right after they had released their name that we want to take your favorite player from your favorite team or something like that. And many NHL experts jumped on that and said, "Oh, they're talking about Brent Burns from the San Jose Sharks." And a lot of people expect the Kraken and the Sharks to develop a pretty healthy rivalry, and especially if the Kraken go after Brent Burns, he's one of the fan favorites, and I think that's one of the main reasons that people thought the Kraken might have been hinting at him. He will most likely be available for the expansion draft. Like I said, he's 35, he's getting up there. I don't see that the Sharks are going to want to protect him. They have probably some more valuable assets on their team that they're going to look to protect first. And if the Kraken take him, obviously Burns is going to have all the motivation, chip on his shoulder every time they play the Sharks. I don't imagine Sharks fans being too happy if the Kraken take Burns away from that team. He's a fan favorite down there. But I could also see the Kraken going in a different direction. Like I said, Burns is a bit old. He's getting up there. But I will say a veteran defenseman is a big piece. You want to have personalities like that in the locker room when you're trying to build team chemistry. I think the Kraken will go young with most of their roster, but you do want a few defensive veteran players that have been professionals for over a decade to help build a good culture at a young expansion team where everybody's new to the locker room. Also, since the 49ers moved to Santa Clara, the 49ers and the San Jose Sharks have had a little bit of a bromance down there. We've seen 49ers players like George Kittle or like Jimmy G always supporting the Sharks, and I don't think 49er players supporting the Sharks goes down too well in Seattle. I think most people in the Seahawks market will look at that and sneer a little bit and probably hate the Sharks a little bit more just for that. I think that's all the questions we have time for today, but I'm glad I was able to answer at least a few of them. The next episode of Around the Sound, episode 4, is slated to be released next Wednesday, so I'm looking forward to being back in the studio to record that. We'll have to talk about the Seahawks and Patriots. We'll have probably plenty of news to talk about. The Mariners will be in their series against the Astros at that point. We'll also have a Sounders game between now and then, so we'll have plenty of stuff to talk about next week. Thanks to all of you that submitted questions. I'm not sure, I didn't get to all of them, I know that. So if I didn't get to your question, be sure to reach out again for the next Q&A opportunity. I don't imagine it'll be too far in the distant future before we have another Q&A segment here on Around the Sound, and so I'll be sure to let you guys know. I'll keep you updated on Instagram and on Twitter if we do have another Q&A sometime soon, so keep posted, stay connected with Around the Sound on Instagram, especially at Around the Sound Seattle. Keep up with me on Twitter at the Peyton Thomas, and have a great weekend. It seems like the smoke is finally going to clear out, so stay safe, everyone. Thanks for listening.